I don't always diagnose receptive language disorders, but when I do, I be sure to comment on reading comprehension as well. Yes, I'm not likely a candidate for the world's most interesting man. I feel like I spend most of my time changing diapers and picking up yogurt containers and applesauce containers and all the toys left on the carpet and blogging about childhood development and language disorders. However, I did just write a blog post that I think is worth checking out that talks about some new ways that we can classify language. I think historical language models have looked to describe the way language operates in the brain, and you'll often see people describing language content, form, and use. And those can be useful to sort of quantify what's going on in a particular profile of a disorder, but it's a little bit artificial in that you can't really tease apart language content and language structure and language use that way. And so we also will see a lot of language reports now that will say receptive language disorder or expressive language disorder. And again, that's a nice way to try and understand how language is functioning in the brain, but you really can't separate them and you can't tease them apart. And where I think it does damage is that it gets people fixated or thinking about only one element or dimension of language. And then we tend to see, IPPs or goal writing objectives that really start to focus in narrowly on just one thing. In expressive language, maybe just looking at grammar. And I don't think that's going to really overall improve a child's functioning. So I wrote a blog post about a different way that we can classify language by looking at sentence and discourse level processing as contrasted with sound and word level processing. And what we see is that this is a much more robust way to diagnose language disorders than what we've historically used, some of the other descriptors. And we also see that when we use this classification system, we're finding a lot of children that go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. So children that have difficulty at the sentence or discourse level of processing almost always get identified because they're having trouble learning concepts. They're learning slower than other kids. They're not following directions. We always want to be sure, though, that if we are diagnosing an oral language disorder for understanding sentences and discourse and vocabulary, there is going to be an impact on reading comprehension as well. And I also comment in my blog, I don't think I've ever actually seen a reading comprehension disorder. If there's problems with reading comprehension, there is an oral language disorder underlying that. And if that's not evident, we probably just haven't looked deep enough and haven't done enough assessment. Where things get really interesting is when we start doing assessment at the sound and word level, when we start looking at subword processing and syllable processing and subsyllable processing with sound processing, we can see a level of disorder there that often gets missed, and it always manifests in reading decoding, and spelling. And a lot of these children don't show up on classical assessments and traditional assessments that really are looking more at the sentence and discourse level and really looking at vocabulary. This processing level will get missed, and these kids will get undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Now that we can use more specific instruments and more specific assessments and go to look at that sound word level of processing, we can more accurately describe a child's learning profile. We can describe where and why they have disorder. And then we can go in and do therapy that actually makes a difference because we're working at the level of processing. Research is bearing this out. There are two levels of processing in the brain. They're separate streams. The factors load on each of those constructs. And I think it's really important to start looking more closely at the assessments we administer as well as the way that we classify language to really reflect what's happening in the brain. All right. I don't know how you would ever vote for this, but if you did want to vote for me as the most interesting man in the world, I don't know if you'd be drinking wine either. I might really have no chips in that game, but hey, it was worth a shot.